The masses never revolt of their own accord, and they never revolt merely because they are oppressed. Indeed, so long as they are not permitted to have standards of comparison, they never even become aware that they are oppressed. Now, as you might have noticed, in the last 12 months or so, I'm putting a reasonable amount of focus on history, on the fact that our history has very likely been changed. Most of it appears to have been fabricated. And with some of the revelations that we've had in the last few years, the revelation of the earth being repopulated with children and the concept of cyclic cataclysms, things have really started to fall into place. Many pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that we couldn't find seem to have all fallen into place, and now we are actually able to build some sort of a coherent picture of what is actually going on here. And of course, it's very different to what we've been told by mainstream academic circles. As seems to be always the way, folks, they just don't like to inform people about what's really going on. And of course, there is a reason for that. A lot of people would think, why? Why would they bother fabricating history? Why wouldn't they want us to know? But really, when you look at some of the cycles it appears that this earth goes through, then it becomes quite understandable why they wouldn't want people to know, because people would simply not be doing the things that they're doing now. You wouldn't be able to get people to participate in this ridiculous slavery system, this ridiculous economic system, if they knew what was really going on here. By fabricating history and by fabricating the rise of feudal empires through history and the rise of democratic governments, everything that they portrayed to us, it kind of creates the excuse as to why the world's in the situation that it's in. It provides the necessary backstory for people to simply accept their servitude. And so it makes a lot of sense for the powers that believe they be to have done this and to presented a completely false history to people. As said by Marcus Garvey, and I've said this quote many times, a man with no history is like a tree with no roots. And it is so true. A knowledge of our history is imperative to have a knowledge really of who we are. Most especially when you look at just how much has been covered up and you look at the potential and possibilities of what actually may have come before. And we also are aware that they once changed the key of music. They raised it from 432 cycles up to 440 cycles, which would have created everything that we listen to now to be slightly discordant with the ambient background of the Earth. And of course, just becoming aware of this, one needs to question the reason that this would have been done as well. You think about it, if sound is used to heal, and if all of the structures that we'd built were built in accordance with the ambient background sound of the Earth, the ambient frequency of the Earth, what would happen if you changed all of our music? Would that not induce some form of sickness or disconnection within the human condition? Indeed, may that even be a way of reducing the human lifespan. If you look at ancient texts and they talk about people living easily for 300 years, could that be because of the resonant frequencies around them? Could that have something to do with it? And there is a possibility, of course, that you could tie this in with the focus that was once put on our brainstem, on our pineal gland, on the inner workings of the human mechanism. There seems to be a huge focus on this, folks, in so much ancient architecture, so many ancient statues. Even when you look at the statues in Egypt, the work of a friend of mine called Chance Gardner, who has been looking at Egyptian statues and realized that many of the statues, even the Egyptian headdresses, appear to be depicting human brain stems. As I mentioned before, even Michelangelo's depiction of God on the roof of the Sistine Chapel appears to depict a brain stem within the neck of God. So there seems to be a real focus that was put on the human brain stem and the power of what we can achieve through the application of consciousness into this 3D reality that we live in. And this seems to be a focus of many cultures, folks. It isn't just the Egyptian culture. When you look at the Vedic cultures, you look at all ancient societies, even when they brought you texts that were related to war or government or the rulers or history or anything, there was always a very spiritual overtone to the whole thing. Many people have thought, oh, this is mystery school stuff and New Age teachings and blah, 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 but really it's not. It's simply a common thread that seems to run through so many ancient cultures, that there was a real effort to make sure the importance of spirituality and the importance of human consciousness was stressed through all of their teachings. And this is something that's very absent from the modern world. This sort of stuff is pushed to the side, and we're taught that it's got no real value in the economic world. What is valuable is good business sense and all the sort of stuff that they put us through, folks, all of which leads us away from any real understanding of humanity and of the reason for the current human condition. And I'd suggest there's a reason for that, folks. And in fact, that this lack of focus is something that's very responsible for the state of the human condition. But even with the way this is pushed into the background with Western society, it's still quite there. You can see it's still quite visible throughout all aspects of Western society. Just look at our religious organizations and look at for example, the Court of the Pine Cone in the Vatican. You look how the pineal gland is there on a statue. Do you really think this was put there by the Vatican, or was this put there by a previous culture? Why does the Pope still carry around a staff with a pineal gland on the end of it? Would he be doing this simply because the Vatican is hiding up the fact that they've calcified our pineal gland? Or is it simply the fact that they picked up the remnants of the old culture and they started promoting the wrong concepts about reality, but just using the same tools to do it? But you can see it's there. Why would the Pope be carrying around a staff with a pineal gland on the end of it if the pineal gland was not something that was absolutely integral to the human condition? And that's an important part to look at. It's an important thing to take note of with all of the ancient teachings regarding this spiritual connection that we once had, is that there is also a huge amount of focus put on human biology. Like I said, it isn't just consciousness. It's on the brain stem. It's on the pineal gland. It's on things that we have within our biology which we can activate in order to take consciousness to a new level, or at least take us back to the level that we're supposed to be at. You've got to ask, why is the pineal gland calcified? And this is what fluoride does, folks. It's one of the main things fluoride does. And you might say, well, we live in a country where there is no fluoride in the water. But even if there is no fluoride in your water, folks, I guarantee it's in the salt. It's in the canned food. It's in other stuff. It's in everything else. They're making sure they're getting it into you so that this pineal gland is closed. But all of these sorts of things are being rediscovered now. People are starting to pay attention to history. And many people are realizing that there is so much wrong with what we've been told and that the evidence is actually all around us. And it's been very encouraging to see this sort of thing happening. And we're finding all sorts of remnants of previous cultures that we hear, folks, and not just the ancient cultures. When you talk about previous cultures, people will automatically think of things such as the pyramids or Alexandria or the Colosseum or the ancient walls in Peru, Sacsayhuaman, places like this. But within our own cultures and within our own cities and with our own societies, there are remnants of quite civilized cultures that existed there prior to modern society ever being formed. We've got buildings here in Australia which simply cannot be explained by convicts coming here and building them, not in the amount of time they had to do it. And we're finding that this same culture can be found all around the world. We're finding what is termed to be Greco-Roman style architecture in virtually every country on earth, here in Australia, in the Philippines, across Europe, even in Japan, in the Americas, in Brazil, Argentina, everywhere. There's also some very strange remains that can be found around the United States, which appear to have been left by previous cultures as well. The sewer system in San Francisco really is remarkable. This is a multi-level, multi-story sewer system, which is huge. It's the size of the city, this sewer system, and it would have been years in the construction. Why is there no record of this ever being constructed? It's quite remarkable. Where would they even have got all the bricks to construct it at the time they did? And when we hear the stories of the gold rush and the way San Francisco was apparently founded, the construction of this sewer system simply isn't taken into account. This would indicate that there was a culture prior to this one that constructed that sewer system. There's a whole bunch of areas around New Haven, around Atlantic City, around the whole New York, New Jersey area, which appear to depict old canal estates, And these are in areas that are considered to be wetlands and considered to be protected areas, areas where nobody really goes, and areas where there's certainly never been any population. And yet when we look at these areas, we find parallel lines, we find parallel canal lines, and we find what appear to be canal estates, or at least the remains of canal estates that appear to have once existed along the edge of these islands or along the coast of New York and New Jersey in some places. I mean, it's very, very strange that these lines and these apparent remains of ancient estates would be there. And very, very intriguingly, even on the ground in some of these places, we find the remains of old power lines. And these look like power lines from the 1920s or 1930s, but again, these are in areas where there was supposed to have never been any people. And we didn't even have electricity until the late 1800s, so what are these power lines doing in these places? It really doesn't make a lot of sense, not if what we're presented with as being modern history is to be believed. Maps of the United States prior to the mid-1600s do not depict the Great Lakes on any of their maps. The Great Lakes do not appear until around about the late 1600s. In fact, if you look at maps from around about 1630, there appears to have been quite a difference between the maps from just 5 or 10 years earlier, and what we see is not the Great Lakes as they're depicted today, but rather a large open section of water and several islands around the place. And it seems that there was a period of upheaval in the early 1600s, and things didn't actually settle down until the mid-1800s, which is the first time we see the Great Lakes actually depicted as they are today. Prior to this time, California is depicted as a peninsula. Then after the 1600s, California is depicted as an island, and a large lake, Lake Conibus, is depicted as existing in the southern western United States. And then after the 1800s, California is no longer an island, and Lake Conibus is missing, and the Great Lakes are depicted as they are today. Another really interesting thing is that on many maps of the United States from around about 1660 up until the mid-1700s show that the northwestern region of the North American continent, up into Canada and Alaska, is all very much unmapped. And yet on maps prior to the 1600s, you can see that the whole area has been quite well mapped. So that's another very interesting thing to take note of. And again, a great many of these maps depict California as being an island through this period. And again, it's not just one map or one particular cartographer that's doing this, it's a large number of them. And what this suggests is that there was some sort of cataclysm that happened in the early 1600s and another cataclysm that happened in the early to mid 1800s. And regarding the cataclysms, the reoccurring cataclysms, and what may be the cause of this, and the fact that the Great Lakes were not there depicted on early maps of North America, comets, cataclysms, coincidence, and it really is worth having a look at, because that's another very striking thing when you look at reports from these areas. You find a massive amount of reports of comet activity in the skies. You find this comet activity is reported quite extensively through the 1600s and again through the 1800s at exactly the period when we were having grand solar minimums. And there is every indication that these grand solar minimums actually constitute periods of extreme upheaval on the Earth. And you've also got to ask yourself, how many comets would you expect to see in the sky? I mean, how often do we see a comet in the sky, folks? Or even a meteor shower or anything you could mistake for a comet in the sky? We really don't see that many. And yet, if you look at some of the reports from around the 1600s and 1800s, you find these comets are being reported like every couple of years, every couple of months sometimes. So you've got to wonder what this was really all about. Was it really comet activity, or was it simply some sort of electromagnetic plasma disturbances that were going on in the sky? And why would we see this comet activity right at these periods of the 1600s and of the 1800s, precisely when there were grand solar minimums, and precisely at the same period as all of the maps appear to have undergone an extreme amount of changes? You've got to ask the question, were the cartographers simply that bad that they didn't notice all these things? They didn't notice the Great Lakes sitting there next to Chicago, how they could put Chicago on a map but not the Great Lakes, but they couldn't see them or something. You know, were they really that bad? Did they got everything so wrong that they had to redraw the map so extensively after the 1600s and again after the 1800s? I mean, think about it, folks. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But really, when you start putting all of the pieces of the puzzle together, you know, the buried buildings, the mud flood, the changing of the maps, the grand solar minimums, the repopulating of the world with children. You know, when you start considering all of these things, pieces of the puzzle really do begin to fall into place. It just depends on how willing you are to think outside the box and how much you're actually willing to consider.